April 1st, 1945. Over the churning waters near Okinawa, the sky trembled with the low growl of distant engines. U.S. Navy destroyers sent walls of flak into the air as kamikaze planes broke through the clouds in screaming descents. On the beaches, Marines clawed their way through the sand and shrapnel, pinned down by entrenched Japanese artillery. The island was turning into a furnace of steel and blood. From a carrier farther offshore, a squadron of blue-winged fighters launched into the haze. Their silhouettes were unfamiliar to many on the ground. Wide fuselage, long nose, and wings that bent like a seagull in mid-flight. As they cut through the smoke-filled sky, a strange silence accompanied them, broken only by the sudden roar of their guns. To the Japanese pilots, it came without warning. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, tracers ripped through fuselages. They tried to bank, dive, climb, but nothing outran it. A single burst was often enough to shred aluminum and bone. Radio chatter turned into static, and men vanished into the sea. On the ground, Marines looked up and whispered a name that was spreading across the Pacific. "That's the Corsair," one muttered. F4U. There were other names too. The Bent-Wing Bird, Ensign Eliminator. But among Japanese pilots, it earned a darker title, the Whisper of Death, because by the time you heard it, it was already too late. It wasn't just a fighter. It was vengeance on wings, forged for a new kind of war, one that stretched from jungle treetops to kamikaze altitudes. And that spring, over Okinawa, the F4U Corsair didn't just fly. It hunted. In early 1942, the Pacific was a battlefield defined by speed, reach, and fear. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan surged across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with terrifying momentum. Carrier-based warfare became the new frontier, and the Japanese Zero fighter reigned supreme. The Mitsubishi A6M was light, fast, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. Its range was unmatched, and in one-on-one combat, it could outturn anything the Allies put into the sky. American pilots, flying the aging Booster Buffalo or the rugged but underpowered F4F Wildcat, quickly realized they were outclassed. Kill ratios tilted sharply in Japan's favor. In some sectors, U.S. squadrons were losing 3 or 4 planes for every Zero they downed. But it wasn't just the air battles that were costing American lives. Down on the ground, on coral beaches and jungle clearings, U.S. Marines and Army units desperately needed close air support. The nature of Pacific warfare meant islands had to be taken one by one, often with little cover and under heavy enemy fire. Aircraft that could provide immediate, powerful ground support were essential. Yet the aircraft on hand were either too slow, too fragile, or unable to carry the heavy payloads necessary for island assaults. The Navy needed a fighter that could do more than dogfight. It needed to escort bombers, engage Zeros, carry rockets, strafe jungle positions, and land on the short, brutal decks of aircraft carriers. In other words, it needed a plane that didn't exist yet. In 1938, the U.S. Navy issued a request for a new carrier-based fighter that could fly at over 400 miles per hour and carry heavy armament. The demand was bold. Some thought it was impossible. But one company, Vought, believed it could be done. As the war spread from Midway to Guadalcanal and into the Solomon Islands, the pressure mounted. American pilots were dying. Ships were being lost. Every battle became a lesson written in oil and wreckage. What was needed wasn't just better training or luck. It was a breakthrough in design. That breakthrough would arrive in 1943, riding on a distinct inverted gull wing and the roar of a 2,000 horsepower engine. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even trusted at first, but it would become a legend. The F4U Corsair was born out of necessity, out of blood, and out of the desperate need to wrest control of the skies from a ruthless enemy. The task of creating the Navy's next-generation fighter fell to Chance Vought Aircraft, a relatively small manufacturer with a reputation for bold engineering. Their proposal was ambitious: to build a fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, outgun the Zero, and operate from the deck of a carrier, a trifecta no American aircraft had yet achieved. At the heart of the design was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was the most powerful engine ever installed on a single-seat fighter at that time. To harness that power, Vought engineers had to think radically. The problem began with the propeller. To fully exploit the engine's output, the Corsair needed a massive 13-foot propeller, the largest ever mounted on a fighter. But this created a dilemma. If the landing gear was made long enough to clear the propeller during carrier takeoffs and landings, it would become too fragile. The solution was the now iconic inverted gull wing. By bending the wings downward from the fuselage and then upward at the tips, Vought was able to shorten the landing gear without sacrificing propeller clearance. The result was a plane that looked like no other in the war. It was long-nosed, angular, and almost predatory in appearance. But the design wasn't just cosmetic. The gull wing added strength, reduced drag at the wing roots, and improved lift at high speeds. Armed with 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, the Corsair packed a fearsome punch. It could also carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs, making it just as effective in ground attack as in aerial combat. Its top speed reached 446 miles per hour at 26,000 feet, over 100 miles per hour faster than the Zero. It climbed faster, dove harder, and could absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Still, the early Corsairs had flaws. The long nose impaired forward visibility during carrier landings. The powerful engine created torque that made takeoffs tricky. Landing gear struts sometimes buckled on hard deck landings. As a result, the Navy initially deemed the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations and instead assigned it to the U.S. Marine Corps for use from land bases. But the Marines embraced it. Pilots adapted. Mechanics tweaked landing systems, installed reinforced tailhooks, and modified training regiments. Within a year, Marine squadrons were requesting Corsairs by name. They called it Hose Nose, Bent Wing Bird, and Sweetheart of Okinawa. As the war progressed, successive versions improved performance and reliability. The F4U 1D added rocket capability. The F4U 4 introduced a 4-bladed propeller and even more power. By the end of the war, the Corsair had evolved into one of the most lethal multi-role fighters of the entire conflict. Its design wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was a response to battlefield urgency. Every bolt, wing strut, and inch of fuselage had been forged under pressure. The Corsair wasn't elegant like a Spitfire. It was brutal, efficient, and unforgiving. It was exactly what the Pacific needed. August 1943, the skies over the Solomon Islands burned with conflict. U.S. Marines had clawed their way onto the beaches of Guadalcanal the year before, and though the island was technically secured, Japanese aircraft still haunted the region. Henderson Field, the Marines' forward airstrip, had become both a symbol of defiance and a target. It was from this battered runway that the F4U Corsair made one of its earliest marks in combat. Captain Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124, the first Marine squadron equipped with the Corsair, taxied his aircraft toward the runway just after dawn, oil-streaked, patched with bullet holes from the day before, and carrying a full load of .50 caliber rounds. His bird was no showroom machine, but it flew, and it killed. Radio reports warned of a Japanese raid inbound. Betty bombers escorted by a screen of Zeros. Walsh climbed rapidly, Corsair engine roaring like a beast let loose. At 20,000 feet, the enemy appeared, a tight wedge of bombers flanked by silver darts that glinted in the morning sun. The dogfight ignited within seconds. Walsh dived first, tearing through a bomber formation and sending one Betty spiraling in flames. As he pulled up, 3 Zeros latched onto his 6. He banked hard, the Corsair's powerful wings holding through turns that would have snapped lesser airframes. Tracers flew past his canopy, but none connected. He rolled, reversed, and lined up on a Zero that had overshot. One burst. The Zero exploded midair. Below, ground crews and infantrymen watched in awe. They had seen plenty of dogfights, but this was different. The Corsair didn't just match the Zero. It outpaced it, outclimbed it, and when needed, could rip it apart with overwhelming firepower. Walsh would go on to score 21 confirmed kills during the war and receive the Medal of Honor. But that morning over Guadalcanal, he was simply the first to prove what many had only hoped.
From Japanese
the Corsair was a killer. And it wasn't just in the air. Later that same month, Corsairs began flying low-level strafing runs against Japanese supply lines hidden in the jungle. With rocket pods mounted beneath their wings and bomb loads that turned trees into matchsticks, the Corsair extended its reach beyond the skies. Pilots began flying so low that leaves and debris clung to their wing edges when they returned. The Japanese took notice. their intercept tactics faltered. Anti-aircraft fire was redirected from bombers to these screaming blue ghosts that tore through tree lines. One captured Japanese officer reportedly said, "It comes like a shadow and leaves only fire." But for the men on the ground, surrounded, undersupplied, and under constant threat, Corsair sightings meant more than tactics. They meant survival. At Bougainville, a pinned Marine unit radioed for support while Japanese mortars closed in. Minutes later, the sky erupted as Corsairs dove from the clouds. Within moments, the enemy guns were silent. A Marine later recalled, "I don't remember the noise. I just remember silence after." That silence was the Corsair. As the war expanded through the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and eventually Okinawa, the Corsair followed. It landed on crude airstrips, leapt from swaying carriers, and flew through monsoon storms. It carried bombs, rockets, and hope. It was not flawless. Pilots still had to fight the plane as much as the enemy. Landing remained difficult, especially on carrier decks slick with oil and rain. But it worked, and it kept working. The first time the Corsair went to war, it didn't just perform, it dominated. And for the first time in years, American pilots in the Pacific felt like the hunters again. When the war ended in August 1945, the F4U Corsair had already earned its place among the most formidable aircraft of the Second World War. But its story didn't end with Japan's surrender. Unlike many wartime designs that faded into obsolescence, the Corsair transitioned seamlessly into the post-war era. Its robust airframe, combat-proven versatility, and upgrade potential made it invaluable during the Korean War just 5 years later. There, Corsairs flew dangerous close air support missions over rugged terrain, often against entrenched North Korean and Chinese positions. While jet aircraft dominated the skies at higher altitudes, it was the Corsair that hugged the ground and delivered precision strikes where troops needed them most. More than 12,500 units were produced across 16 different variants, an exceptional production lifespan for a piston-engine fighter. Its later models, such as the F4U-4 and F4U-5, featured even more powerful engines, four-bladed propellers, and upgraded avionics. For some smaller nations, Corsairs remained in active service well into the 1960s, even engaging in combat in regional conflicts across Latin America. But beyond statistics and deployment records, the Corsair left behind a deeper legacy. It became a symbol of resilience for the U.S. Marine Corps, a plane that was rejected, then reborn, and ultimately beloved by those who flew and fought under it. Pilots who once struggled to master its tricky landings would later write memoirs describing it as the finest machine they had ever flown. Museums across the United States and allied countries now proudly display restored Corsairs, many bearing the faded squadron insignias and kill marks from their wartime service. Perhaps most telling is how the Corsair lives on in memory, not just as a weapon, but as a character in the Pacific theater. It was featured in war documentaries, flight simulations, and even post-war Hollywood productions. Generations later, its silhouette, long nose, bent wings, massive propeller, remains instantly recognizable to enthusiasts and historians alike. For the Japanese who faced it, the Corsair was a phantom, silent until it struck, unstoppable once it did. For the Marines below, it was the sound of salvation. For aviation engineers, it was a benchmark of piston-powered perfection. In the final accounting, the F4U Corsair didn't just restore balance to the Pacific skies. It redefined what a fighter could be, fast, fierce, and unrelenting. Its reign was not born of elegance, but of necessity. And in that necessity, a legend took flight, bent-winged and battle-scarred, but never broken. The F4U Corsair was not just a machine of war. It became a symbol etched into the collective memory of those who lived through the Pacific campaign. Its silhouette, with the unmistakable inverted gull wings and roaring engine, came to represent more than firepower. It embodied resolve. To the Marines who fought under its shadow, the Corsair was salvation delivered on steel wings. To the American public, it became a fixture of war bond posters, airshow flyovers, and later, television serials that romanticized its defiant grace. It was no accident that decades later, the Corsair would still appear in films, memoirs, and museums. In the minds of a generation, it stood for a moment when America clawed back the sky, when zero visibility didn't mean zero hope, when a bent-wing bird could defy an empire. On the battlefield, its presence helped redefine the doctrine of close air support. Unlike traditional dogfighters that prioritized air superiority at altitude, the The Corsair lived at the treetops and sea level, hugging terrain, braving flak, and delivering precision fire just meters from friendly lines. This down-in-the-dirt role would echo through future aircraft design. Decades later, when the U.S. Air Force and Navy began to field new support aircraft, echoes of the Corsair's philosophy could be seen in platforms like the A-1 Skyraider and eventually the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Both prized ruggedness, loiter time, and low-altitude firepower, lessons learned from the Pacific Islands. Even the Corsair's heavy frame, built to absorb punishment and return home, inspired future design thinking around survivability. In an age of ever-sleeker jet fighters, the Corsair proved that brute resilience was sometimes the best armor. Its six-gun layout, its versatility across roles, escort, interceptor, bomber, gunship, made it an early model of what would become the modern multi-role combat aircraft. For military historians, the Corsair remains a case study in adaptation. A plane once rejected for carrier use, reborn through tactical necessity. It challenges the notion of perfection in military procurement and instead celebrates the power of field innovation. For engineers, its gull wing remains a marvel of aerodynamic compromise. For tacticians, its success redefined the value of air-ground coordination. And yet, beyond all metrics and manuals, the Corsair's legacy resides in quieter places. At a small airfield in Pensacola, one restored Corsair sits under soft museum lighting. Its nose still bears faded squadron numbers. Tourists pass by, some unaware of what it did, of who it saved. But every so often, a veteran pauses. He doesn't speak. He simply rests a hand on the cold metal fuselage. In that silence, there is more than memory. There is reverence for a machine that did not ask to become a symbol, but flew until it was one.